Welcome, my friends, to the Quantum Shamans presented by MOSHI, the Ministry of Shamanic Healing and Integration, bringing you insights into the spiritual secrets of the mind and the universe around you. We are here to help you on your spiritual journey and path of healing. And now your hosts, David and Anthony.
Welcome to Quantum Shamans. Today, we're interviewing my teacher, my beloved teacher, Zane Curfman. Zane, welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Glad to be here. Great place.
Welcome. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah,
3 generations of Paqos. So
Yeah.
That's amazing. David, before we get started, do you want to read the material you have?
Sure. This is our MOSHI vision statement. The Ministry of Shamanic Healing and Integration aims to help individuals heal from spiritual maladies stored as energy in the subconscious that manifests in the form of trauma, PTSD, physical illness, mental health issues, and addiction. These practices include, but are not limited to, yoga, breathwork, meditation and mindfulness practices, Reiki, sweat lodge ceremonies, sensory deprivation, sacred plants, and any other rituals we collectively decide to establish. We hold ritual ceremonies for our community to heal collectively in a safe space, as well as individual ritual healing tailored to the members of our collective for the purpose of intensive inner work. Our most important responsibility is to help our members integrate their individual and collective experiences in order to ameliorate their spiritual maladies and spread love for the betterment of mankind. Our belief is that our collective consciousness is God. Every living organism has a purpose and is essential for homeostasis. From the single-cell organisms to the observable universe, we are all connected and equally important. We all deserve love, respect, peace, harmony, and forgiveness. Love is the most powerful force in the universe. Love conquers all.
Indeed.
Awesome.
Thank you, Dave.
That's great. That's your mission statement?
Yes.
Well, it couldn't be said better, man.
Thank you. Came from the heart. Took me like 15 minutes to write it. It just came pouring out of me.
Absolutely. That's what we're talking about. That's the medicine. Mm-hmm. That's what the world needs now.
What the world needs now is that sweet medicine. Right?
Absolutely.
Love, sweet love.
Our goal is just to help others feel like we do, and in turn they can spread that to other people, and that's how you grow consciousness, and that's how you change the world.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's not with guns and power and money, it's with love.
It's like something I hear a lot of people say when they say hurt people, and I like to add to that, healed people, heal people.
Absolutely.
That's a beautiful thing. That's a beautiful thing. Zane, thank you so much for making the journey up here to be with us. We're so stoked and excited. I've been excited all week. I had a hard time sleeping last night. I had all kinds of, it's just very happy. I don't get to spend a lot of time with you in physical space.
That's true.
So it's fantastic for me. And I'm so happy that you're here. Thank you, Zane, for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here and to be in this energy and to meet you, Dave. And, just to really get a sense for what you're doing, which I think is just great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zane. Let's jump into what Zane does. Let's jump into that space. I guess the first question I'm going to ask you, Zane, is how did it start? How did everything start for you?
Well, really, my entire life was very spiritual. My father was a Baptist minister. He's a missionary preacher. And so I was kind of born into this spiritual kind of atmosphere. On top of that, I was also born in the mountains of West Virginia, so it was kind of a poor kind of a community. So in that time period, there was a lot of root working, which is working with the magical power of herbs and plants. There was a lot of mediumship, and there was a lot of what we call witching, water witching, because most people didn't have city water. So when you had a piece of property, you had to find a place to dig a well. Well, there was no sonars or anything back in the day to find that. So someone would come out, and we call it today dowsing, but the old word for it was water witching. And it was always a man, because only men could water witch. And they'd come out with a Y-shaped stick, and they'd walk around and they'd feel the frequency. And then that stick would eventually hit the ground, and that's where you dug your well. And, you paid these people some good money for them to come and do that service for you. And it had to work, so frequency, vibration, and all that was always a big part of my life. Also, I was always really connected with nature. Where I grew up, it was wonderful because, on pretty much all four corners of the neighborhood was a woods of some type that I could get lost in. So I always had this connection with nature and different forms of nature. I actually had communications with nature. I knew the spirit of my grandmother's house. And when I was there, certain kind of ideas would come to me. And that was our communication. I knew the spirit of my house. There was this beautiful park down the road from me. No one knew about it. It was up on the top of a high hill. And it was just, it didn't get grown over because a few neighbors would cut the lawn and stuff. But it was just pretty much abandoned all the time. But there was one of the most sacred spots to me, where there was this sacred oak that its roots wrapped around these boulders and created these levels that you could just sit at. And that would always take me introspective. It would always take me deep into myself and help me to move through some of the wounding in my own life, because growing up in that type of environment, there was a lot of desperation. There was a lot of what we now know as poverty mentality. So, there was a lot of abuse. So it was an interesting time and a beautiful place to grow up. And that's how it all started, was with these experiences that were just very natural for me. And I didn't know that they weren't natural for other people. I really didn't know other people didn't have this ability or didn't communicate with the land. I think they all had the ability. I think it has to do with the way we're raised. I was lucky enough to have this more spiritual mindset that was instilled in me. My father, like I said, was a Baptist missionary preacher and a Freemason, but my mother, she was a gifted psychic. But she was also raised in a United Brethren church, which is a very fundamentalist church. She had this power of gift, this gift of vision in her dreams. And it was something that was passed down in her family. The female line in my family, this gift gets passed down in, and we knew that. But that fundamentalist framework that she was raised in, she believed it was something of the devil, because God doesn't do that. God doesn't give you visions and things like that. So she never really developed it to its full potential. But yet, I remember just moments where she would just wake up from the night of sleep, and she would just know that she had to start calling the relatives because she had a dream about one of them. And I got to see, especially in my young life, about 4 different relatives that died the day that she had the dream about them. And that would really cause her a lot of pain and a lot of grief. And she just didn't understand, what is this gift that if I can't help people? And so, that mixed with the fact that she thought that it was something demonic, held her back for a long time. But luckily, toward my early teenage years, she had embraced it a bit. And she actually was able to stop some tragedies in our family from happening. So, she always taught me to kind of listen to my inner voice, listen to my intuition, and understand that strange experiences can happen and other people might not understand them, but they can still be very important. So that's really where it all began for me, and then it was in my early 20s that I started taking it even more seriously, when I started doing healing work and started working with clients and things like that. And there was this spirit that came to me, and I called it Tulsi, because I had connection a little bit with a Hindu community at that point, a Hare Krishna community, and they have a plant called Tulsi, which is a very special plant for them, very sacred plant. And that's what it sounded like it said its name was. I knew it wasn't exactly that, but it sounded like Dulce. And I was like, okay, I'll just call you Tulsi. And it was a rainbow serpent. And it came to me and it taught me certain things. It taught me a dance, which is kind of like Qigong in a way, or Tai Chi, a way of developing and magnifying its energy within me. And then it taught me something that it basically referred to as like psychic surgery. It's not the psychic surgery of, cutting into someone and ripping out tumors, but it was more of an etheric kind of surgery. And it taught me this other technique. And it taught me to start to take people's disease into my stomach. And that when it entered my stomach, it would split into 2 colored streams. It was like a blue and a pink stream. and it would split, and it would go into the upper world, the lower world. And this I found very interesting. And, at that point, it's my late teens, early 20s. I'm like, did I make this up? Does anyone else do this? Where does this come from? I've seen some amazing results with it, but what is it? Is it all in my imagination? Because I always felt blessed with a powerful imagination. So I was like, I got to start researching. And back in those days, research was mostly done in libraries. The internet existed, but it was in its rudimentary form of just information pages, and so
was there anyone else like around you? Is there any other people like with you that you grew up with that were also sensitive or open to these things, or were you?
Well, I mean, not that I grew up with, like my grandma that I mentioned, my grandma Curfman, she was a Christian brujo. So she was a type of witch, and so she did tarot cards, and she knew about the magical power of certain herbs and the power of prayer and things like that. My other grandmother, my mother's mother, my grandma Opal, she was a natural mystic, not trained by anyone. But if someone was sick, she would just go to sacred spots in the woods near her home, and she would build an altar that no one knew about. And she would pray for them at that altar, and she'd work that altar for them and try to help them with it. And then when she was done, she would destroy it, And so there was those kind of influences. When I got in my later teens, I started running into more people who were spiritually minded, and had a little more experience with certain things. And there was a core group of us in my late teens and early 20s that had found each other, that had kind of traveled different paths. Some more of a Hindu path, a tantric path, some more a Wicca or paganism. There was a lot of paganism. And we all kind of shared, and we kind of bounced ideas off of each other and kind of helped each other grow a little bit, But really, for the most part, no, not outside of the fact that everyone knew that it was there and it was real. The community knew it was real, but it was hush-hush. No one talked about a water witch until you brought them out. Then they did their witching. No one talked about the root worker or the hoodoo man unless you needed something done for you.
Then you don't talk about it anymore.
Yeah, and then when it was done, it went back under, and they just became Joe down the street again, So it existed, but it was pretty hush-hush.
Yeah. But when you started, so you're saying when you started to research, you were trying to research, and at that time, because this is the 90s, right?
Yeah.
We're about the same age. So yeah, we were about the 90s, and this starts to happen. There's not a lot of information for you to find like we have now.
Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of information, and what you could find was few and far between. My stepdad, he was a mystic in his own right. He was born in 1910, and he was born on a farm. Now, he would never call what he did mystical or magical, but like if he was going to grow, while he was growing his plants, he would stand out there and he would raise what we would call raising up the energy of the earth, of Pachamama. And he would sit there and he would just praise the plants and how beautiful he saw them growing and giving gratitude to the plants before they even grew. And his plants would just explode and grow like crazy. So he taught me that. My father, who was also a very mystical person, he taught me some breath work, so some basic centering breath work, and he always believed in the power of mind over matter. So there was a lot of that kind of teaching in my youth. And he also, I forgot what else I was going to say about him. Anyway, so he was one of the people who helped instruct me in my very early age, but he died when I was 10. So, I never got to move further into the teachings he had and the understandings he had on life. There was some charismatic Christian understandings there that when you pray, you're not praying from your ego self. That type of prayer is useless. There's no point in that. You don't pray for someone because, oh man, there's something wrong with them. You go into a space and you fall in and you find that still quiet voice within yourself, and then that voice prays. That's the voice of the divine. That's when a prayer has power. That's when it has a magic that can actually transform things. So there was those type of people. And then there was my high school girlfriend. Her father was a funeral director, and he took me under his wing, and I became an apprentice funeral director. And he was very mystically minded, partly because of the rites of the funerary sciences, and partly because that's just how he was built, you know. So I received some good instruction there on how our mindset and how we view the world actually helps to create the reality we experience within it. But flash forward back to what I was saying when I was doing my research, I had never heard of this, you know, taking an illness into yourself, taking a darkness into yourself, taking, you know, from that perspective I grew up in, a demon into yourself and transforming it, changing it within you. You know, all of the people who practice things, they always were practice shielding, you know, closing their closing their energy field down, or creating a shell around their energy field so things couldn't come in, especially those dark things. You know, you did a healing, you ripped it out of the person, you threw it in the fire, you threw it in the water, you did something like that, but you were afraid of contamination. Yeah. And this was a form of healing without fear, a form of healing where you took on that with your client. You took it on. So I kept researching, and finally I did find that there was a lineage. It's one lineage in Peru, the Huascar lineage, from Don Benito Quaresma Vargas, that held this secret, this knowledge, and they call it the Huchemiqui, the eating of heavy energy. And that, you know, and I've worked with medicine priests from the Quero tradition, which is the Incari tradition, and from the Corilazo tradition, and from many other traditions in Peru, and they didn't develop this. Those other traditions don't have this. You know, the Quero and many of the other traditions still use their cuyas, which I teach my students to use as well, to eat the hucha. But they didn't learn to do it themselves. That was something that was inside of the royal lineage after Pachacuti Inca. And Huascar Inca was the great-grandson of Pachacuti Inca. So it was something that was developed in Cusco itself, inside of the royal lineage of the tradition. And when I discovered that, I was like, well, who knows this tradition? Who has a connection to this tradition? And it was hard to find. You know, when I started researching, of course, there were some names, some big luminaries that popped out. One of the biggest, because he's really the one that he's one of the people responsible for bringing shamanism to the modern age, was Alberto Villaldo. And he is of the Incari lineage and a couple other lineages in Peru, but he wasn't of the Huascar lineage. So they weren't really doing too much of this type of work. So I continued to research, and eventually I found an anthropology professor in Cusco, Peru. His name was Juan Núñez del Prado. And Juan's father, Oscar Núñez del Prado, was also an anthropologist, and he started a movement to regain the indigenous people's rights in Peru, which was unheard of at the time. We're talking about the 1950s, and he did this because he met a few Quero villagers who were at a ceremony, and he just happened to notice they were wearing very old patterned textiles. And when he really listened to their communications, they were speaking Cusco Quechua, but it was different. You know, it was a different dialect. And Cusco has a whole unique dialect of Quechua from the rest of the country and from the Quechua-speaking world. And this was Cusco, but it was different. So he asked them where they were from, and they said they were from high up in the mountains in these communities that were called the Q'ero villages, the Q'ero nation now. And he found out that they had, they had always lived at those high elevations, but after the conquests of the conquistadors, after colonization, they just stopped coming down from the mountains much. So they just stayed up there. Now, this is an anthropologist's dream, to meet a secluded community. I mean, they still came to Cusco now and then. They still communicated with the modern world, but their entire lifestyle was in these mountains. They were still living the old ways. They didn't have money, and until just the last 5, 10, maybe 15 years, that's been the case. Because there's big racism in Peru, and the indigenous are not treated well, and they don't get to do jobs. They don't get to apply for good jobs and things like that. They mostly end up either working for drug cartels or, in the coca industry, or they end up in prostitution or other things like that, selling their wares on the streets. They held on to this ancient form of life. So he started working there, and he started to help them. And him and a few other men came together to create this this coalition, basically, to change things so that they could get their land back. Because at that time, even though very few Spanish and Westerners lived at those high elevations, there was a few ranchers. And they created this system of slavery, basically, and they had enslaved these people. So even though they were still living their traditional way of life, they had to come to the rancher's ranch and farm their land as well. Herd their llama too. And if their llama got sick, which happens with llama a lot, then these little indigenous people had to take llama from their own herds and give it to them. If they didn't get the produce they were expecting, if the harvest wasn't as big as they were expecting, they would force these Q'ero to make up what they didn't get out of their own fields. And so it was a very bad system. And so Oscar Nunez del Prado and a few other men, who several of them actually got murdered in this fight, eventually got the rights of the Q'ero, and they became their own nation within Peru. And they have their own lands now and their own identity within Peru. Later, my teacher, Juan, he's going to become an anthropology professor. So he goes and he decides he wanted to see if he could create like a thesis, his master thesis, on the indigenous tradition. And what he thought was going to be a very simple, small thing that wasn't going to be very in-depth, ended up being about 10 years of his life just to try to start to truly understand it. And during that time, he met one medicine man who held the information of the structure of the whole tradition. He met a couple of them, but one became his main mentor, which was Don Benito Quarryman Vargas. And him and Don Benito started to work earnestly together. And he started to learn the entire tradition from Don Benito. And that is where the Huchimiqui, or that technique that this spirit had come to me, taught me, that's where it came from. So I had to find Juan. Mm-hmm. So that started my work. And that wasn't easy at that time either, just running down where someone was going to be and running into them and making sure that the correct things had been put in place. But eventually I got to start to work with Juan, and I was fully accepted by Juan, very quickly learned the teachings he had to offer. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where all that started. Yep.
I love the story. I love how it was rediscovered, and it seems like it's random in some way, but it sure isn't. Mm-mm. And then just even like we were talking before we started to roll, and we were talking about some of the experiences I've had and David has had, like the similarities are fantastic. How it's Huchimiqui that seems to just show up in this organic state that shows up like we're led to it before we learn it. Yeah, and that points to something. Mm-hmm. That points, one, to the Huascar tradition, the Huascar lineage.
But it also points to something else. Huchamikwi cannot be done from a fear-based mentality. Okay, that doesn't mean that fear doesn't exist in you anymore or anything like that, but it can't be done from that place. So we have different levels within the priesthood, and the Western mind is a little strange where we think of levels as stairs. And, that if you're on the top step, you're better off than the person on the bottom step. And they kind of use the metaphor as stairs in the tradition as well, but they don't see it that way. They see that a priest that is at the second level is completely parallel to a priest at the fourth level. The only difference is how the spirits work with you and how your work moves forward. So here in the West, in indigenous Peru, there's very few people of the third level. There's most all the priests there and shamans are what we call the Pampa Masayok, and it has its own series of levels. And the Pampa Masayok is the earth priest. It basically means he who sits at the low table or the low mesa, but that's not a bad thing because it is that low table, that low mesa position that is able to reach out to the earth, that is able to do these ceremonies that will bring a whole community into harmony with the earth. The other path is the Alto Masayok path. And the Alto Masayok, they have those responsibilities as well, but their real gifts come from the upper world. Their real gifts are this celestial energy, these star energies, and translating that and helping the earth and the humanity, the community, raise up to those kind of energies. So still in Peru, there are very few Alto Masayoks, and even fewer that are of the fourth level of the Alto Masayok path. But this Huchamikwi that pops up, and people like myself and you two just having this natural ability with it and this natural way of looking at it, that's something that comes directly from the fourth level path. And the fourth level path is where we step out of the paradigm of fear and fear-based reality. It doesn't mean fear doesn't exist. Doesn't mean that I can walk out there and get hit by a bus and I'm okay. I should be afraid of getting hit by a bus. But what it really means is that my fear of the spiritual world has diminished.
Right.
And because of that, I am no longer afraid of spiritual energies, spiritual influences. Now I have a different model that I can work with, and I can help to transform those energies. As in Tibet, the Buddha came and transformed the demons into the devas, into beneficial spirits that ended up being the protectors of the new Buddhist tradition. Where the older tradition, though very powerful and beautiful, it was afraid of those things, and they lived in fear of those things.
Fear-based.
Yeah, and that fear-based mindset creates certain qualities within cultures and within communities. It creates a atmosphere where competition is the main goal.
Right.
We compete with each other, and we see everything as limited. Okay, so there's a limited amount out there. If I don't take it, someone else is going to take it, and I won't have it. And so when we start to step out of that paradigm, we start to step into a new reality that everything is abundant, that there is an amazing amount of abundance throughout the entire universe, and that we can actually take as much of the living energy as we want, and we can use it to transform the quality of our lives right here and right now. And that doesn't mean that, I take this big piece of abundance and now $1 million falls into my lap. Maybe that's the way the universe plays it out, but maybe the universe plays it out another way. And that's where our mindset also comes in. Everything's driven by our own personal mindset, our belief system. So if we believe in fear, we also believe in a judgeful and vengeful God. If we believe in a judgeful and vengeful God like my mother did, then a beautiful spiritual gift like her psychic ability gets swept under the table and becomes something that you have to hide from people. It becomes something you never fully develop to what it could be because you're afraid of what other people will think about it. You're afraid of what God will think about it. And if God doesn't like it, then God's going to punish you. And that's really, I think that in the Western culture, we're so ready for a new paradigm. And so there's more and more of us that are waking up at this fourth level understanding of harmony instead of polarity. And with harmony, we can step into a new world. We can step beyond these old fear-based mentalities that have kept us trapped. And it's really what's going on with our country right now is a shift. We're going through a humongous shift, and we're not sure. It's actually even greater than our country. It's the whole world. We're deciding who we want to be in this new age, because no doubt a new age has begun.
Yep.
Absolutely.
And it's up to us. The spirits aren't going to do it. We're the ones in the bodies. It's our responsibility to create a new world. And we can only do that with a new operating system, with a new paradigm.
The belief that, or the knowing that we are God, our collective consciousness is God.
Yeah, and that's...
So what is there to be afraid of?
And that's something...
If we are that.
And that's something our culture is taking on. That's something that's still a little bit scary in Peru for some of the people of Peru to take on. But our culture is starting to take that on. What? Maybe you were 12 when you realized that?
I was probably in my 20s.
Oh, your 20s? Well,
Yeah.
I was going to say...
I wasn't very... I didn't grow up in a very spiritual family. I grew up Catholic, but my parents, I don't know, first 10, 12 years of my life took us to church just because that's what they thought they were supposed to do, because that's how they grew up. It wasn't because of their beliefs. It just was because that's what they thought they were supposed to do.
Yeah.
So my family is not a very spiritual family. So I wasn't really exposed to that. I was just exposed to the fear-based Catholicism, where you better toe the line or you're going to hell.
Well, there's another side of Catholicism as well, though, that's very beautiful. And I can only speak of this because I'm from a Protestant tradition. So Dave Byers, that mystic I was telling you about, who took me under his wing and started helping me to be... he became my mentor in funeral directing. The funeral home we were at was a Catholic funeral home. So we were doing Catholic ceremony. So I got to sit a lot with the priest and talk to the priest. And there were some that were very deep. I mean, very, very tuned in. The one that I remember is Father O'Reilly. He was from Ireland, and him and I would, and he would talk outside of the indoctrination of Christianity. When he talked about mystical things, he would not relate it back to the Bible. He would relate it to mystical experiences. And so there was this real beauty with talking with him. But there was this other thing that was beautiful, and that was the mystery of the Eucharist. You know, that for the Catholic Church, you know, that is truly the body of Jesus. That's truly the blood of Jesus that you're taking during communion. For the Protestant churches, it wasn't that. There was no miracle of the Eucharist that happened. It was symbolic. It was all symbolic, and you took it in a symbolic state, and it was almost like saying, you know, you don't get what Jesus and his disciples got. You get this step-down version of it that's not quite as good, but it means the same thing, and you know, and God will have some kind of grace on you. But in Catholicism, that's really happening. You're really having a communion with God at that moment. And I found that very beautiful, you know.
Yeah, because I can relate to some of those things. I grew up in a pseudo-Christian kind of home, like it's kind of different. So it kind of turned me into an atheist. All I could see was lies and trouble. And so my intellectual mind is what took over, and that's all I could see.
Yeah.
And so the difference for me was, I think for me not having a fear-based mindset is because I didn't have any previous teachers to imprint on me.
Yeah.
I see that a lot with a lot of people that I work with personally, and people have been on the path for a long period of time. A lot of it, what it is, it's programming from previous teachers. Yeah. Creating limitations in the mind is usually what it is. Like being afraid. Like I never had thoughts a little bit. So when I first started the apprenticeship, I was kind of used to working with upper world beings and energies, and even Kaipacha, this layer of energy. I was kind of afraid to go into lower world because of the indoctrinations that were in the back of my mind.
Yeah.
Playing like, no, lower world, bad. Don't go there. Don't do that. You don't wanna do that. But then it was very short lived. It wasn't, it was just showing me about where my conditions were, what I was agreeing to.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the thing about our minds and how we program our minds. Our minds aren't everything in spirituality, of course. Our belief systems aren't everything. Belief systems, they're all BS. There's no real truth in a belief system. Its power is just in how it controls you. And the mind controls a lot of things, but especially in our work and as we grow on the path, and this is something we kind of learn from following one of these paths, the mind can take a back seat. And when that starts to happen, there's something else that comes forward, kind of like what I was talking about with my father saying, there's a spirit that comes and prays through you. Something else comes forward. The mind can't, as my godfather Hector says, the mind can't change the mind. One person's mind can't change another person's mind. The mental is a set thing. And you have to go one level of abstraction above it. So if we look at ourselves as different bodies, we have the physical body, we have then the emotional mental body, which some people split into two different bodies, but really they're parts of one another. And then on top of that, we then have the spiritual body. So to make a change in the mind and to make it really work, it's much easier if we reach up into the spiritual realm and make that change there. It will then come down the stream to the mental, emotional, and to the physical body. But if we try to make it just on the mental level, and a lot of people do work with this, and they're doing great work with it, NLP, and there's some other things where you're working with affirmations, where you're working with changing or reframing the way you're seeing reality. Well, that has power in it. But it takes a long time for that power to work its way.
Repetition.
Yeah, it takes a long time to change a mind. A mind doesn't change easily. We have to continue working at it, continue growing it, continue fostering it. But if we can go one step higher into the mystical realm or into the soul level, and we can change the map there, we can have a new vision of our future. Vision. Not words. Words are mine. If we can have a new vision of our future healed state and we can start living from that and we can start bringing that to us right now and we can start broadcasting that energy out into the world, then the mind will start to get behind that much quicker than if we sat around and did affirmations. We might have to do 1 million affirmations before we start to make a change in our mind that we can notice. With this vision, we might only have to visualize it 4 or 5 times before it starts to have real effects in our lives. And that's just working with the higher part of the mind. Then there's the actual spiritual. And the spiritual is beyond all of that. It's energy. And the spiritual, we say it has 2 syllables. It's a language with 2 syllables, heavy and light, on or off. And when you start to live life that way and you start to feel the ons and the offs of life and you start to learn how to flip the switch on when it's turned off and you start to really flow into the harmony, but you can only do that in a harmony-based paradigm, in a love-based paradigm. You cannot do that in a polarity-based paradigm because if what you're afraid of is evil and the evil is out there, you'll never let it close to you. It will never have a chance to change. And anything that you might deem as evil inside of yourself gets pushed down into that lower world. And then that lower world is something scary because that's where all your demons are. That's where all of your unhealed sides of yourself are. That's where our imprints are. That's where the root of our limiting beliefs are. Because the limiting belief is not the mental stuff we say to ourselves. We can change that. People reframe things, right? Hey, man, don't think of it that way. Think of it this way. Well, that's great. Okay, so I reframe that. So now that thought never has any power over me again. But because that imprint is still alive, the root of that imprint is alive, it's going to wrap itself around a new thought.
It's still
that
in
old
your
one,
cellular memory.
Yeah, because it's stored inside of the cellular memory and the muscle memory. And until we go into that place and open that up, and that's that lower world, because the lower world of the earth, the inner earth, the lower world of the shamanic universe, and our inner body is all the same place. They're all parts of one another. So as we go in there, we're actually surfing, or we say we're working with the serpent, and the serpent is taking us down in there and showing us the nooks and crannies, and we're discovering what's in there. Generational curses. Like I was talking about a poverty mentality. That's a generational curse. Then there's cultural curses, that success means that you are independently wealthy. Okay, now you can't feel happiness in your life until you achieve what your culture has told you have to achieve. And it sets the bar high, so you can never achieve it. So you're always trying to get at that carrot, but never actually getting it. And so if you never feel fulfilled in yourself, you're not going to radiate your entire light to the world. If you don't radiate your light to the world, you're not going to be playing your part in this great tapestry. Because grace works through us. Yeah, we learn healing techniques and all kinds of other things, but the greatest healing that happens is when you're living your life every day and you don't even know that you're doing something. You don't know that something you just said, someone at the table next to you heard, and that changed their whole life. They never said anything to you, but maybe they were contemplating suicide, and they just heard you say something, and maybe it was just something self-referential. Maybe you were just talking about how happy you are in your life, and maybe how, you realize it's not about achieving what everyone says you have to achieve. You can just right now choose to be happy. And just hearing a thought like that might change their entire life, changes the outcome of their life, and you never even knew they were there. And that's the power of grace. And that's what I'm really turned on about these days, is the changes that happen that you aren't even trying to put into place.
Right.
Just by you having the awareness in yourself and loving yourself enough to go out after your dreams and just to be your authentic self, that suddenly it's having changes in the whole reality. And you don't have to do a ceremony. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is be you.
Be.
Yeah.
Just like performing a huchamiqui on somebody who's having a bad day at the grocery store while you're standing in line, and you completely change their energy and they walk out a new person. Yeah. And they don't know where it came from. They just...
Yeah, and we call it relieving the weight. We talk about weight. Hucha means weight. It means heaviness. It's one of those syllables of the spiritual language, which is energy. Energy is either heavy or it's light. And neither one's bad. One of the metaphors in the mountains is, a crate of apples is heavy. Carrying it 7 hours back to your village is hard work. It wears you out. It's hucha. But when you get there, it's food. And you get to eat on it. And everyone in your family gets to eat on it. So you get to eat that hucha and you get to transform it into something beautiful that is helping others, And just those little moments like that, you change the field for that person. So these limiting beliefs and stuff that we walk around with, these generational curses, I see them as gravity wells. Okay, and the earth's like a gravity well, the sun's like a gravity well. So it's density, it's reality. And it starts to pull hucha from the environment, from other people. You ever notice two people who sit down, especially in our culture, they sit down and they start introducing themselves to each other, and what do they talk about? Hey, well, I do this. Well, how much do you make? Well, I make this much, competition. Or they start talking to each other and they start talking about the worst thing that happened to them.
Oh, if you think that's bad, you should see how bad it is for me.
Yeah.
I like to listen to people actually do that, where they compare, like, I'm having a harder time than you are.
Yeah, because in our culture, suffering, it goes back to that Protestant Christian belief, suffering makes you better. There's some reward for suffering. You're going to get something great because if you suffered more, or the universe owes you something if you suffered the most. And so everyone's putting all their attention, all their awareness into suffering. And they're sitting there and they're bonding over their traumas. And they're just bringing each other down. And they're sharing hucha. They're sharing weight. They're pulling it from each other because they have wounds inside of themselves. Those wounds are pulling in hucha. They walk down the street. They hear someone over there screaming at someone else because they almost got hit by a car. They're pulling that hucha into them. What if they were the one that almost got hit? Or what if they were the one driving? And all of this is hypothetical. It's all in the mind. But the mind and the body doesn't understand that what happens in the mind isn't real. there's no difference
Right.
to the body. It's the same thing. So it's just pulling in more and more trauma.
And it reacts, and the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, and
Yeah.
illness arises.
Exactly. So when we do something like the Huchamikwi, or even when grace just happens and we've done nothing except for be or shine and beam our own light, broadcast who we really are, when we do something like that, it can lift some of that weight up off of a person. And when that weight's lifted up off of them, suddenly their imprints, their traumas aren't right on the top, you know? So now when they go home and their children are trying them, I mean, that's the child's job, is to try the parents, and the children are sitting there, you know, fighting for control or fighting for their own existence, the parent can see it that way. They might not react and scream at the child. They might not pass down trauma, generational trauma to the child. They might go home, the child might do that, and because we've lifted this little bit of weight off of them, they might suddenly be able to share that gift with that child. You know, just that moment. It might only be one moment in that child's whole life, but one moment they really got to connect with their parent, and their parent didn't judge them. Their parent didn't put them down. Their parent didn't act like a parent, but acted like someone who loved them, who really brought them in. You know, in that moment, that could change a person's life forever. Those moments stick with you. Trauma moments do too, but those moments stick with you, and they help to propel you in life.
I love it.
Love is always the greater power.
This has been the Quantum Shamans presented by MOSHI with David and Anthony. We look forward to seeing you next week for more insight into who you are and your place in the universe.